Yes. So we have some time before lunch for questions, and yeah, I mean we can just. If you have something to ask for Cory, of course he was most recent, or if you have asked something from before, or you have a question sideways related, is also fine. And I will give the microphone out to whomever wants to ask a question. Who dares first? Oh, Jonathan, good. He's paid, that's why he's first.
So your point on, or Krishnamurti's point, or your point also on structure, it's something that I've never really completely understood, the way Krishnamurti talks about structure. And so can you go a little bit more into that? What is this structure that he's talking about, and how does he kind of explain it? And then also, you did an excellent job in presenting a really difficult set of stuff to, we were talking that each slide could have been a presentation itself. And then where did you find difficulty in presenting, because it's a really rich set of information, where did you find difficulty, and where did you find conflicts in presenting the information yourself?
So is the mic working? I don't know if it matters, but just to answer the question in terms of structure, at least if I understand the question, I think it's interesting because in terms of Krishnamurti's work, the structure really is kind of the whole thing. So structure includes not only what you know about the world and what you've learned about history and mathematics and whatnot, but also how you've learned to behave physically in your environment, emotionally, how you respond to people around you. So somehow there's like it's like the sum total of your existence in the world. So it's not that it's just the structure of your brain scientifically, or the structure of your relationships within your family, but it's somehow that the human being has a way in which it lives in the world, and that way and all that it includes is structure. I don't know, and yeah, I mean, mostly it was just really interesting to do the research and make this presentation. If anything was difficult, it was figuring out what to not include. There are a lot of things that I excluded because I thought it would be too difficult to say simply. So there are whole components about or different components about what Krishnamurti speaks about that I thought was best to leave out, just in terms of creating some kind of focus, some central focus on what it means to be free from the known. So if there was any difficulty, it was that, finding really, really amazing bits and having to decide to leave them out. Something like that, yeah.
Thank you. Excellent presentation.
Thanks.
Back on the structure question. Part of my structure is a distinction between me and you.
Mm-hmm.
From Krishnamurti's point of view, is that an illusion? There really is no distinction between me and you, and how can we understand the nature of that kind of reality if that's the case, where the distinction I have between me and other people is utterly an illusion? What is the nature of that deeper reality in which we're not the same? So maybe I'm misunderstanding Krishnamurti.
I think it's an interesting question. I'm not quite sure how. I can't answer specifically for Krishnamurti, but I would say that, like, in general, it's almost like it's more interesting to approach that question assuming it hasn't been asked before, because we have a whole body of spiritual knowledge that says there is no me and you, that we sort of, so then we look at, okay, so is me and you an illusion? It's more, maybe more interesting to look at it like actually in our relationship, like how we relate, to somehow come back down onto the ground. So it's not a matter, the question isn't, is there a me and a you, but what occurs between us and how does that function? How do we function together? Somehow there's a real question there versus a question about, is there a me and a you, is a question that like assumes so many layers of ideas that have come before. It's almost like a question that's born out of like a residual understanding that there's some spiritual realm in which there's not a me and a you, or that, does that make sense? At least for me, it's more interesting to just get rid of that question, because there's obviously something occurring. So what is occurring? And if you say something and it really hurts me, or I react in a certain way, I feel differently than if you say something and you please me, or I feel there's all these kinds of things that go on that are actual, that don't matter whether or not a me and you are real or not. Does it make sense? Somehow I think that's, yeah.
Can I add something? Like, obviously the body is different, right? I mean, your body is not my body, and so on that. But
Yeah.
but it would be interesting to. I'm not answering the question, but I'm just maybe adding something to the question. Imagine that what we discussed about freedom exists, and it's a human possibility. What would be our difference if you would be free and I would be free? Where would so because then the individual self would not be anymore a differentiating element. So that would be maybe an additional question. What is then the difference?
Hmm.
I don't know. 1, 2, 3.
I just wanted to make a comment on the comments. I'm wondering if this somewhat relates to what Carl Jung was talking about with the collective unconscious versus the individual unconscious, and the intersection, the relationship between the two via archetypes and so forth. If maybe he did it with different terminology, but he was in that same area. And also, the idea of you and me, it seems to me, is the knowing. I mean, I have all kinds of stuff from experience, past, culture, whatever, that I approach a other with that defines that. So really, from what you're saying, Cory, getting in between, the interaction between and staying there, is a way of dealing with what the knowing is and getting away from that being what the you-me thing is.
Yeah, it seems like you could have presented your presentation equally the same if you headed it fear of the unknown, because it comes out to the same place, the absence of self, and being willing to confront the construction of an artificial thing within ourselves, which we identify as me or I, and I think that's probably where you're going eventually, but it could be just as well fear of the known or fear of the unknown, as well as freedom from the known.
I hope I can ask this in a clear enough way to be understood. with regard to the fact that, or with regard to the supposition that the known and knowledge is certainly required and functional in some areas, and the proposition that in others, in terms of perception, it actually gets in the way because we're actually bringing stuff in. Then the question is, bringing it in or not bringing it in must be, would have to be an involuntary, almost an innate reaction. Because if not, then you bring in the doer who decides whether or not to bring in the knowledge or not bring in the knowledge. And then we're back to the self, and that gets us into basically an automatic loop. It gets us back in the loop. So we're always looped back into this doer, experiencer, thinker, self, as Kay sometimes said, you know, it's basically juggling content within the consciousness itself. So my question is, how, when, and in what form is that decision made by the living organism as to bring in the knowledge or to leave out the knowledge?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I feel like somehow the question itself assumes that there would be a correct and an incorrect way to do so. So it's more about, or there's something about understanding the action of knowledge that is itself that's where the value lies. That you and I may make mistakes. We may over-apply knowledge, and we're not necessarily going to start off the bat and be correct about how we interact with one another and how we use knowledge. But if our attempt is to really understand how it functions, especially between us, that attempt alone and that attempt to really understand itself may be enough. That may be something in itself. So it's not to say that we're not going to make mistakes. We may over-apply, or we may make a wrong decision. And that's not denied. It's not that we're saying that by being free of the known, you're going to always be correct in everything that you do. It's more that being free of the known is more akin to understanding. It's like a continuous movement of understanding how knowledge is operating. So we may make mistakes, but if we acknowledge those actually, we can continue to understand, versus making a mistake and not acknowledging it, and then moving from that unacknowledged mistake. There's a difference there somehow. I don't know if that quite answers it, but that's sort of how I understand.
But then the whole concept of a mistake comes in, which...
Well, I bring in mistake because you say, how am I supposed to decide when? What's the right decision? And so I'm saying, you're not going to know. The only decision you can make is the decision you've been conditioned to make. So it's sort of owning that actually and knowing that we are conditioned, but that we can attempt to move beyond that, but it requires that we continually understand that what we're moving through. So we don't know how to decide is the truth.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yes,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, great.
Yes, yeah.
So my question sort of comes after this discussion, and I begin to see, yes, we are individuals, we are different, we have our fears and our misunderstandings. Is it possible for us to meet, to try and understand and listen to each other and see, then maybe we'll see the same thing, maybe that's being one. Otherwise, how can two entities so different be one? We can, in caring and sharing and getting to know each other, come to the same seeing. Is that possible?
I mean, I think it's more possible only in the attempt. If you and I are both actually attempting to do so, already we're kind of together in a way. So it's difficult. Even the idea of oneness is sort of the idea of whether, is the sort of the same question as whether or not there's a you and a me. If we strive to be one, we're sort of striving towards something that isn't real. But if we're actually together and we're attempting to interact despite all of our misinterpretations and our unique stuff, somehow it's more about the quality of our relationship and less about what it is we're attempting to look at. So it's more about relationship and less about what we say and think. If that quality of relationship is there, somehow we're already together. That's what it feels like.
I understand that we are two different people. For us to look at
Yeah.
the same thing at the same time is hard.
Yes.
But
Yes.
if we, too loud, but if we at least are attempting with care to see that, yes, I've come to see you, and if I cannot make the attempt to see it your way or understand what you're saying, and maybe that's the oneness I can only get to, where there's an understanding of where you are and I am are at the base of the same thing. Is that possible? Or not?
Yeah, I don't know. I come to the same thing. I think it has something to do more with are we together in we attempt to come together through sharing knowledge together. So eventually, if I get you to say or think the same thing I say or think, we call that together. But actually, there's a different kind of together, which means you and I are just together looking at something. We may have very, very different ideas about something. But there's a quality of relationship that doesn't necessarily require that we share the same ideas. It seems that must be necessary because I don't know that it's possible for 7 billion people to share the same idea. But it must be that we have the ability to relate to one another despite our differing ideas. So I think that's sort of the point, is that what we're used to is relating through our knowledge. So if I can just coerce you or convince you that what I think is correct, or you can do the same to me, or we can slowly chop away and meet in the middle, that's how we come together and relate. That we misunderstand relationship altogether in that respect. That there's something that's relationship that's beyond our different ideas. Beyond or before, it's something simpler, like. So I don't know. I don't know if that really answers your question, but it's more, I agree. I think that there's something about relationship, and there's a value in relationship that has nothing to do with sharing or agreeing on ideas, but more the attempt to, any sort of attempt to meet. I don't know. You know?
Don't you think that no one is...
I think he passed the, sorry.
Okay. I think just in certain response to that too, I always feel like it's the, from one of Krishnaji's statement that we so perceive reality as we are conditioned. So the idea that, whether we can share an opinion or understanding, I mean, you're all going to come from different places. And, I think we can keep talking about all of this forever. And but the core of it is like when you remove the language, when you remove all this, the ego and all of that, it's wonderfully, there's a connection when you remove that me and the self. But I want to ask something completely more personal, if you don't mind. I'm very curious about like how you got interested at a young age with Krishnamurti. And you're saying you've been archivist for the past 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And we all, to a degree, have a certain sense of we know Krishnamurti through his writings, talks, and his books. I'm curious, while in your archives, is there other stuff that has piqued your curiosity that we are unaware of, or it's unknown to us that you can share? I'm always interested in the little personal.
Yeah, I can't give the secrets away now.
I don't mean any juicy stuff. I mean, there's always a thing that's not in the known of all the books and stuff which I think is fascinating. I don't know if you can share.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wish I had an interesting answer, but the truth is as an archivist, I'm so very little interested in Krishnamurti as a person that I haven't really pursued anything out of the ordinary. So aside from having access to an insane amount of material, there's really no difference, right? So it's not that I've like seeked out and discovered personal elements or things about I know very, very little about his history as a person, actually. So my role as an archivist is more of a technical one and not really a personal one. I don't do much personal research in that regard. I mean, in terms of the work, yes, especially putting this together, yes, I have access to a lot of the work, but no, I don't really have any juicy details. No, I know, but no, yeah, more I'm just left with, I'm sort of in awe at the amount that this man traveled and said, really, and on the fly, that's really what you're left with, is that there's an insane body of work that was never rehearsed, that has a coherence, but also subtle contradictions and very interesting sort of, but it's interesting in that regard, for sure. Yeah.
So, Cory, can we finish, because it's almost 1 o'clock, but there's one question from the online.
Yeah.
And the question is, well, there are 2 questions, but I choose the last one. I think the first one is already answered. But so, is my awareness of my knowledge a part of that knowledge? That's the question. Is my awareness of my knowledge a part of that knowledge?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It seems like what the distinguishing factor is what happens with an awareness of knowledge. So if I have an awareness of my knowledge, if that informs my behavior next, it seems to be only a part of it, becomes a part of that knowledge. So yeah, it sort of depends on how it's active. To be aware of knowledge doesn't really last. If it lasts, then it becomes knowledge. So yeah. There was an interesting quote I didn't include in here, but there's an interesting bit where Krishnamurti really sort of, he directly sort of responds to this whole bit about, so if you really understand what attention is, then you'll see that it's incredibly powerful. But even that seeing that it's incredibly powerful can become a trap. So you attend to something fully and you see that something dissolves in front of you and something new really does happen. You see that. So the next time you're in a sense of disorder or despair, you decide to attend. And that whole, so it, again, you move into this, so there's a constant way in which we, even if something really has something true in it, it can always become untrue somehow. It can always become another way in which we decide to manipulate our experience. So, yeah, I don't know. I think it's interesting. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. We're having a break now. We meet again at